Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is start over when everyone thinks it's too late. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. 61-year-old Brenna Vale walked away from her life without a word. She left her grown children, her empty house, her failed marriage. She drove north into the woods, where her grandfather once taught her to build, with her own 2 hands. With nothing but old tools and a faded photograph, she claimed a forgotten piece of family land. People saw her at the lumberyard and whispered, "Divorced women her age don't just disappear. They don't build cabins alone in the wilderness." But in 90 days, Brenna built more than a house. She built herself back. What did it cost her? And what did she discover out there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Brenna Vale left her old life behind, the house on Maple Street stood silent in a way that felt permanent. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway, labeled in her careful handwriting, "Kitchen, books, garage." The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter, signed and notarized 3 weeks earlier, the ink still looking too fresh for something that ended 34 years of marriage. She stood in the empty living room, sunlight cutting through the bare windows where curtains used to hang. The walls held ghostly rectangles where family photos had been. Marcus's college graduation, Olivia's wedding, vacation snapshots from places that now seemed to belong to someone else's life. She'd packed those photos carefully, but she wouldn't be taking them north. Those memories belonged to the woman she used to be. Her truck sat in the driveway, loaded with what mattered now: her grandfather's toolbox, a canvas tent, a camp stove, 3 changes of work clothes, and a small wooden box containing Theodore's field journal and a single black-and-white photograph. In the photo, her grandfather stood beside a cabin he'd built with his own hands in 1954, one palm resting against the logs, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Brenna locked the front door for the last time. The realtor would handle the rest. Marcus and Olivia would be furious when they found out. But she'd left each of them a letter trying to explain what she barely understood herself. How do you tell your children that you spent decades being the person everyone needed, until one day you looked in the mirror and couldn't find yourself anymore? The drive north took 6 hours. She stopped twice, once for gas and coffee at a roadside station, once at a diner where the waitress called her Hon and didn't ask questions. The landscape changed gradually. Suburbs giving way to farmland, farmland to forest, the trees growing denser and taller as she pushed deeper into the North Country. Her marriage hadn't ended with drama. There'd been no affair, no single moment of rupture. It had simply eroded like water wearing away stone. Year after year of pleasant conversations that never went deep, of sleeping beside someone who'd become a stranger, of maintaining appearances while something essential inside her slowly starved. Robert wasn't a bad man. He was a good man who'd stopped seeing her sometime in the early 2000s, maybe when the kids left for college, maybe earlier. And she'd stopped seeing herself too. Marcus, her eldest, was 35 now, a corporate lawyer in Chicago, with a corner office, and a wife Brenna had met exactly 7 times. He called every Sunday at precisely 2 p.m., their conversations following the same safe script: weather, work, health. Nothing real ever surfaced. He'd been shocked by the divorce, then worried, then quietly resentful in that way children get when their parents stop performing the roles they'd counted on. Olivia was 32, a marketing executive in Seattle who posted aspirational photos on social media. Artfully arranged breakfast spreads, sunset yoga poses, everything filtered to glowing perfection. She'd been the one who cried when Brenna announced the separation, but the tears felt more like grief over a disrupted narrative than actual connection. Neither of her children had asked Brenna if she was happy. They'd only asked if she was sure. She crossed into the North Woods by late afternoon. The pine and birch closed in on both sides of the 2-lane highway, the canopy filtering sunlight into green gold columns. The air through her open window smelled of resin and earth, clean in a way that made her realize how long she'd been breathing recycled air. air that had passed through too many lungs in too many rooms, where no one said what they meant. The turnoff came up on her right, exactly where she remembered it. A rutted logging road with a faded sign reading "Private Property." She'd only been here 3 times in her adult life. Twice for her grandfather's funeral 10 years ago, once 5 years before that. But childhood summers lived in her muscle memory. She'd been 10 the first time Theodore brought her north, teaching her to read the forest, to understand how trees grew and water moved, to respect the land's patience. The logging road climbed for 2 miles through dense woods before opening into a clearing. 40 acres of family land, most of it virgin timber, with a small meadow where her grandfather's cabin had once stood. The cabin had burned down in 1987, electrical fire the county had ruled, and no one had rebuilt. The land had simply waited, passing through probate, through her father's indifferent ownership, and finally to her when her father died 3 years ago. She'd put the deed in a safety deposit box and tried not to think about it, but lately she'd thought of nothing else. Brenna parked at the edge of the meadow and stepped out into waist-high grass studded with late summer wildflowers. Crickets sang in the afternoon heat. Beyond the meadow, the tree line stood dark and permanent, marking the boundary between what had been cleared and what remained wild. She walked to the center of the clearing, where the old foundation stones still lay scattered, half buried in moss and soil. Theodore had quarried these stones himself, fitting them together with a stonemason's precision. Brenna knelt and brushed dirt from one, revealing chisel marks from 70 years ago. Her grandfather's hands had shaped this stone. Those same hands had taught her to hold a hammer, to sight a line, to understand that building something true required patience and respect for materials. The sun dropped toward the trees, painting everything amber. Brenna pitched her tent in the meadow, staked it carefully, and unrolled her sleeping bag inside. She unpacked her camp stove and made coffee in a dented pot, sitting on a foundation stone as evening settled around her. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full of wind moving through branches, birds calling their territories, the vast breathing presence of the forest. She pulled Theodore's field journal from her jacket pocket. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and dense with her grandfather's precise handwriting. He documented everything: measurements, weather observations, notes about wood selection and joinery techniques. But between the technical entries were glimpses of the man, reflections on patience, on this satisfaction of work done well, on the way building something with your hands teaches you who you are. One entry, dated June 1954, read, "Raised the ridge beam today. Louise came out to see it, brought the children. Brenna's mother asked if she could help with the roof. That girl's got steady hands and a builder's eye. Told her yes, if she's willing to learn proper. Some folks are born knowing how to listen to wood." Brenna traced the words with one finger, her throat tight. She'd been 8 years old that summer, skinny and serious, handing her grandfather nails and watching him work. He'd let her hammer her first board that July, guiding her strikes until she found the rhythm. She could still feel the weight of that hammer, still hear his voice. "Trust yourself, Brenna girl. The nail knows where it needs to go." When had she stopped trusting herself? When had the steady-handed girl become a woman who moved through her own life, like a guest in someone else's house? The stars emerged one by one, more than she'd seen in decades. The Milky Way sprawled across the black sky, that river of light her grandfather had taught her to navigate by. She lay back on the foundation stone, jacket bunched under her head, and studied constellations. Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, the summer triangle still visible in the western sky. Tomorrow she would begin. She had 90 days, a self-imposed deadline, though she couldn't say exactly why 90 felt right. Long enough to build properly, short enough to force commitment. She had her grandfather's journal, his measurements, his techniques. She had the photograph showing how the cabin should look. She had 40 acres of standing timber she could harvest selectively, though she'd need to buy milled lumber for most of it. She had savings from the house sale, enough to fund materials and tools. What she didn't have was any experience building something this substantial alone. Theodore had built with neighbors, with family, with a community that gathered for barn raisings and cabin builds. Brenna had only her memories of watching him work, of those childhood summers when her small hands helped in small ways. But she also had this, a bone-deep certainty that if she didn't do this now, she never would. That if she walked away from this clearing, she'd spend the rest of her life as a diminished version of herself. And that slow fade would be worse than any failure. She fell asleep under the stars, dreaming of sawdust and straight lines, of walls rising board by board, of becoming someone who knew how to build the life she actually wanted to. Live morning arrived with birdsong and cold dew soaking through her tent. Brenna crawled out, muscles stiff, and stood in the meadow watching sunrise burn the mist off the grass. The air tasted like autumn coming. That first hint of change in the temperature, the angle of light. She had until early November before winter closed in hard. 90 days. She made coffee and oatmeal, ate standing up, studying the meadow with new eyes. She needed to clear more ground for the foundation, mark the exact footprint, figure out how to get materials trucked in over that logging road. The nearest town was Pine Haven, population 847, 20 minutes back the way she'd come. She'd need to introduce herself, find suppliers, navigate the local social landscape carefully. Small towns had long memories and firm opinions about outsiders, especially women of a certain age, doing things that raised eyebrows. But first, before anything else, she needed to walk the property. She needed to relearn this land, understand what had changed in the decades since she'd last been here, figure out where water ran and how the light moved through the days. Building started with listening, to the land, to the materials, to the quiet voice inside that knew more than you thought it did. Brenna spent that first full day walking her 40 acres, Theodore's journal in her back pocket, learning the boundaries again. She found the old survey markers, stone cairns her great-grandfather had built in 1952. She found a spring feeding a small creek that ran along the eastern property line. She found the grove of white oak Theodore had planted the year she was born. Trees now 53 years old, tall and straight and strong. By evening, her legs ached and her boots were muddy, but she'd mapped the land in her mind, understood its contours and resources. She stood again at the clearing center, watching shadows lengthen, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but the beginning of purpose. The first honest feeling in longer than she wanted to admit. The next morning, Brenna drove into Pine Haven. The town straddled Highway 47, its main street lined with brick storefronts from another era, a hardware store, a diner, a feed supply, a bar called the Timber Lounge. She parked in front of Riverside Lumber, a sprawling yard, stacked with dimensional lumber and building supplies. Inside, sawdust hung in the air, lit by fluorescent lights. A young man behind the counter looked up from his paperwork, mid-20s, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, name tag reading, Kenny. "Help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary in the way small-town people greeted strangers. "I need to order lumber for a cabin build," Brenna said, keeping her voice steady and businesslike. 20 by 24 footprint, single story with a loft. "I have a materials list." She slid Theodore's journal across the counter, open to the page where her grandfather had documented every board, every nail, every piece of hardware. Kenny studied it, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. "This is old school," he said. "Your husband doing the build?" "No husband," Brenna said simply. "Just me?" Kenny's eyebrows rose, but he had the grace not to comment further. "You know what you're doing?" "I'm learning as I go. My grandfather built cabins. He taught me the basics." "Basics won't frame a roof," Kenny said, not unkindly. "You got anyone helping you?" "Not yet." He whistled low, flipping through the journal pages. "This is a lot of work for one person. Especially," he stopped himself, but Brenna knew what he'd been about to say. "Especially for a woman your age. I have 90 days, Brenna said. "And I'm willing to pay cash for materials delivered to my site. The old Vale property off Timber Creek Road." Recognition flickered in Kenny's eyes. "Theodore Vale's land? Thought that was abandoned." "It was. "It's mine now." Kenny studied her more carefully, reassessing. Old Theodore was a good man, knew his craft. "If you're his kin, maybe you got his hands." He pulled out an order form. "Let's see what we can do." They spent an hour going over materials, quantities, delivery schedules. Kenny warned her about supply delays, gave advice on foundation work, suggested she talk to Giles Pritchard about surveying if there were any boundary questions. When Brenna finally walked out with a delivery date and a dent in her savings, she felt the weight of commitment settle on her shoulders, equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. At the diner next door, she ordered coffee and a sandwich, sitting in a corner booth. The lunch crowd was small, a few older men at the counter, a young mother with 2 restless children, a waitress named Patty, whose name tag looked as worn as her shoes. Patty poured coffee without asking, her hands efficient and practiced. "New in town?" Patty asked, setting down the pot. "Building on family land north of here," Brenna said. "The old Vale property. Theodore's granddaughter." Patty's face softened. "I remember him, good man. Used to come in here for pie every Saturday, regular as clockwork. Apple with cheddar never varied?" She paused. "You building alone?" "I am." Patty nodded slowly like she was working out a puzzle. "That's something. You need anything, you let me know. Small towns talk, but we also help when it counts." It was the first real warmth Brenna had felt from anyone in Pinehaven, and it loosened something in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." She spent the afternoon at the county clerk's office, verifying her property deed and checking for any outstanding liens or easements. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Wendell Harp, pulled the files with bureaucratic efficiency, his expression neutral. Everything was in order. The land was hers, clear and free, 40 acres bordered by state forest on 3 sides and 1 private parcel to the east. "Who owns the adjacent property?" Brenna asked, curious. Harp consulted his records. "J. Menley, bought it in 2003, pays taxes by mail." "Never met them." Brenna filed that information away. She'd need to respect her neighbor's privacy and property line. Keep her build well within her own boundaries. Driving back to the land as sunset approached, Brenna felt the day's accomplishments stacking up like the lumber she'd ordered. She'd introduced herself to the town, established her credentials, set things in motion. Tomorrow, the first delivery would arrive, foundation blocks and gravel for the pad. The building would begin in earnest. That evening, she sat by her campfire with Theodore's journal open on her lap. She found an entry from September 1954, "Foundation complete." "Stood on those stones today and felt something I haven't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind that puffs you up, but the quiet kind that comes from doing something right. Tomorrow, we start framing. The hard work begins." Brenna picked up her pen and wrote in the margin, "Day 3. Foundation starts tomorrow. The hard work begins." "I'm ready." She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she was learning that readiness was something you claimed, not something you waited to feel. Week 1 passed in a blur of physical labor that left Brenna's body screaming. The foundation blocks arrived as promised, 30 concrete blocks each, weighing 40 pounds. She unloaded them one by one from the delivery truck, muscles burning, hands blistering, despite her work gloves. The driver watched her with barely concealed skepticism, but said nothing, just had her sign the invoice and drove away. She spent 3 days leveling the site and laying out the foundation according to Theodore's measurements. The work was methodical, precise, measuring corner to corner to ensure perfect rectangles, checking level obsessively, adjusting and readjusting until everything aligned. Her body protested every movement. Muscles she'd forgotten existed announced themselves with sharp authority. But each evening, standing back to survey her progress, she felt a growing sense of capability. Her hands remembered more than she'd realized. By the end of the first week, she had a proper foundation pad. Level, square, ready for the floor frame. She'd also accumulated a collection of new injuries, scraped knuckles, a bruised shin, a spectacular purple bruise on her right shoulder from learning the hard way how to position a pry bar. But she'd also developed calluses on her palms and a new economy of movement, her body adapting to the work's demands. That Friday afternoon, as she was squaring the last corner post, a county vehicle pulled up the logging road. Wendell Harp climbed out, carrying a manila folder, his expression apologetic. "Miss Vale," he said. "Sorry to bother you out here." Brenna straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. "Is there a problem?" "Maybe, maybe not." Harp opened the folder, pulling out a surveyor's map. "I was reviewing your property file, doing my due diligence, and something caught my attention. Your foundation here," he pointed to where she was standing. "According to this 1952 survey, it might be within 15 feet of your eastern property line. That adjacent parcel, the Menley property, the boundary runs right through those trees." He gestured toward the tree line she'd thought was safely beyond her build site. "The deed is clear," Brenna said, keeping her voice level despite the cold fear pooling in her stomach. "This clearing is where my grandfather built his cabin. It's been Vale property since 1952. I'm not disputing ownership," Harp said. "But property lines can be tricky, especially in old surveys. The Menley parcel was subdivided from a larger lot in 2003, and sometimes those subdivisions create boundary questions. I'm recommending you get a professional survey done before you go any further, just to be safe." "And if the boundary's different than I think?" Brenna asked. "If part of my foundation is on Menley's land, then you'd need to either negotiate with Menley for an easement or move your build back." Harp's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "I'm sorry. I know you've already put in work, but it's better to know now than after you've framed walls." After he left, Brenna sat on one of her foundation blocks, the weight of the setback pressing on her chest. A week of brutal labor, and now it might all be wasted. She'd have to hire a surveyor, wait for results, possibly start over. The 90-day timeline suddenly seemed laughably optimistic. She stayed there until twilight, anger and frustration warring with exhaustion. Finally, as the first stars appeared, she pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the ambient noise of a restaurant. "Mom, is everything okay?" "No," Brenna said, and then her voice cracked. "I don't know. Maybe I've made a terrible mistake. What happened?" "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. Physically fine. But the land, there's a boundary question. And I might have to start over. And Marcus, I'm so tired. And I don't know if I can—" She stopped herself, realizing she was on the edge of breaking down completely. There was a pause on the other end, then Marcus's voice, gentler than she'd heard in years. "Mom, listen to me. Where are you right now?" "Sitting on a concrete block in the middle of the woods. Are you safe?" "Do you need me to come get you?" "No, I'm safe. I just needed to hear someone's voice." Another pause. "Mom, what you're doing is crazy. You know that, right? Building a cabin alone at 61. But if you're going to do it, you're going to hit obstacles. That's part of building anything. You taught me that, actually. Remember when I was 12 and wanted to quit piano because Beethoven was too hard?" Brenna smiled despite herself. "I told you anything worth doing was going to fight back." "Exactly. So this boundary thing is the build fighting back." "You'll figure it out. You always figure things out." They talked for another 20 minutes, the longest real conversation they'd had in years. Marcus told her about a case he was struggling with, admitted he was reconsidering some of his life choices, asked real questions about how she was managing physically. When they hung up, Brenna felt steadier, like she'd reconnected with a part of herself she'd been missing, the mother who could accept support from her children instead of always being the one providing it. The next morning, she drove back to Pine Haven and found Giles Pritchard's surveying office in a small storefront between the hardware store and a tax preparer. Giles himself was in his 70s, white-haired and weathered, with the careful movements of someone whose body had logged decades of outdoor work. When she explained her situation, his face brightened. "Theodore Vale's granddaughter? Hell, I should do this for free. Your grandfather helped my daddy build our barn in 1958. Spent 3 weekends with him. Wouldn't take a dime." "I can pay," Brenna said. "But I need it done quickly." "Give me 2 days," Giles said. "I'll run the survey myself, pull the original boundary markers. If they're still there, and knowing Theodore they will be, we'll know exactly where your line runs." True to his word, Giles arrived Tuesday morning with his equipment. Brenna spent the day watching him work, learning about survey techniques, helping carry equipment through the woods. They found the original stone cairns her great-grandfather had built in 1952, marking the four corners of the 40-acre parcel. The cairns stood solid and true, each stone carefully stacked, testament to someone's patient work 7 decades earlier. When Giles finished his calculations, he spread his maps on the hood of his truck, showing Brenna the results. Her foundation wasn't just on her property, it was a full 20 feet from the eastern boundary. The tree line she'd worried about marked a natural border, but the legal property line ran well beyond it. "You're good," Giles said. "Build wherever you want in that clearing. It's all yours." The relief hit Brenna so hard she had to lean against the truck for support. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you. Thank your grandfather," Giles said. "He's the one who taught people around here to do things right the first time." That evening, Brenna called Olivia with the good news. Her daughter answered video call, and Brenna got her first glimpse of the construction site through Olivia's eyes. The half-finished foundation, the tent in the background, Brenna herself looking sunburned and exhausted and covered in dirt. "Mom, you look terrible," Olivia said, but there was worry in her voice, not judgment. "I look like someone who's been building a foundation," Brenna countered. "And it's square and level and exactly where it needs to be. I still think this is crazy. I know you do. But Liv, I need you to understand something. For the first time in decades, I'm doing something that's entirely mine. Not for a husband, not for children, not for anyone's expectations. Just mine. Can you try to understand that?" Olivia was quiet for a long moment, her carefully made-up face thoughtful on the screen. "I'm trying," she finally said. "I really am. It's just hard to watch you struggle." "Struggle isn't the same as failing," Brenna said. "I'm learning that distinction." After the call ended, Brenna walked to the center of her foundation and stood there as the sun set. The crisis had passed. The land was hers, the boundaries were clear, and the build could continue. But more than that, something had shifted in her relationship with her children. They were starting to see her as a person separate from her role as their mother, someone with needs and dreams, and the courage to pursue them, even when it looked crazy from them. Outside, she pulled Theodore's hand-forged axe from her toolbox, a perfectly balanced tool with his initials carved in the handle, something she'd found in the storage unit when clearing out her old house. The weight of it in her hands felt right, felt like inheritance and permission and claim all at once. Walking to the edge of the clearing, she chose a young birch that had seeded itself too close to where her cabin would stand. She raised the axe and brought it down, feeling the blade bite clean through the trunk. The tree fell with a satisfying crash, and Brenna stood there, breathing hard, feeling something fierce and necessary wake up inside her. Tomorrow the lumber delivery would arrive. Tomorrow she'd start framing the floor. Tomorrow the cabin would begin to rise from its foundation. But tonight, she'd claimed her ground, marked her territory, and proven, if only to herself, that she had the strength to see this through. Week 2 began with the lumber delivery, 2,000 board feet of dimensional pine, enough to frame the entire structure. The delivery truck couldn't navigate the logging road's roughest stretch, so Brenna spent 2 days hauling lumber in her pickup, load after load, stacking it carefully in the clearing to keep it off the damp ground. Her body was changing. The softness of suburban life was burning away, replaced by functional muscle and endurance she'd forgotten she could have. Her hands, once smooth from lotion and manicures, were now calloused and scarred, strong enough to swing a hammer for hours without cramping. The floor frame came together slowly but steadily. Brenna worked from Theodore's journal, cross-referencing every measurement, checking her work obsessively. She cut joists to length, notched them for the beam pockets, assembled them into a grid that would support the cabin's weight for decades. Each piece had to be exact. Too short and the structure would be weak, too long and nothing would fit. On the 3rd day of the floor build, she noticed someone watching from the tree line. A woman, maybe late 50s, stood at the edge of the clearing with a professional-grade chainsaw resting against her shoulder like it weighed nothing. She wore work pants, a faded flannel shirt, and boots that had seen serious use. Her hair was steel grey, cut short and practical, and her face had the weathered quality of someone who lived outdoors by choice. "You're building on Vale land," the woman called out, her voice carrying across the clearing without shouting. "I am," Brenna replied, setting down her hammer. "It's my land. I'm Theodore Vale's granddaughter." The woman walked closer, moving with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the woods. "Figured as much. I'm your neighbor, Jude Menley. My property's through those trees." So this was the mysterious J. Menley. Brenna studied her, trying to read intent. "Wendell Harp said there might be a boundary question, but we had it surveyed. I'm well within my property line." "Harp's an idiot," Jude said bluntly. "I know exactly where my line is. That's not why I'm here." She gestured toward the floor frame with her chin. "That ridge beam there, you planning to lift it yourself?" Brenna looked at the 20-foot beam lying on the ground, waiting to be raised into position. She'd been worrying about that exact problem for 2 days. The beam was heavy enough that lifting it alone seemed impossible, but she didn't have any other options. "I'll figure it out," Brenna said. "Or I could help," Jude said. "Takes 2 people. That's just physics." They stood there for a moment, taking each other's measure. Brenna saw in Jude's face the same thing she'd been seeing in her own mirror. Someone who'd chosen isolation, but maybe didn't want it to be complete. "I'd appreciate the help," Brenna said finally. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together, and Brenna discovered that Jude's competence went beyond holding up beams. She was a professional timber faller and chainsaw instructor, someone who'd spent 30 years working in the woods. Her hands knew tools the way musicians know instruments. When she picked up Brenna's level and checked a joist, her movements were economical and sure. They didn't talk much while working. There was no need. They fell into a rhythm, communicating through gesture and the shared language of people who understood construction. When they finally got the ridge beam into place, secured and true, they stood back together, breathing hard, satisfied. "You build before?" Jude asked, pulling a water bottle from her pack. "Not like this. My grandfather taught me the basics when I was young. Then life happened and I forgot." "You're remembering," Jude observed. "Hands don't forget, they just need reminding." "What about you?" Brenna asked. "You built your place?" 15 years ago. Smaller than this, but mine. Every board, every nail." Jude took a long drink. "I'll come back tomorrow if you want, or not." "Your call?" Brenna surprised herself with how quickly she answered. "Tomorrow, please." Jude nodded once and disappeared into the trees as quietly as she'd arrived, the chainsaw on her shoulder, moving through the forest like she belonged there more than anywhere else. That evening, Brenna drove into Pinehaven for supplies. The lumberyard was closed, but she stopped at the diner where Patty was working the dinner shift. The place was busier now, farmers finishing their day, a few families, the ambient noise of small-town life. Patty brought coffee without being asked and set it down with a slight wince, her left wrist supported by a brace. "Arthritis?" Brenna asked. "Getting worse," Patty admitted. 40 years of holding trays and coffee pots." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "New owner's been making noises about me taking early retirement. Says they want to freshen up the staff." The injustice of it hit Brenna hard, someone being pushed out after 4 decades of loyal work simply because her body was showing its age. She thought about her own fears, about being invisible, about society's casual cruelty toward women past a certain age. "That's discrimination," Brenna said quietly. "You know that, right?" "Knowing it and fighting it are different things," Patty said with a tired smile. "I don't have lawyer money." Brenna left a larger tip than usual, a small gesture of solidarity between women who worked with their hands, who understood that bodies wore out but dignity shouldn't. Driving back to the property, she thought about visible and invisible labor, about who got respected and who got discarded, about how much of her life she'd spent performing work that no one acknowledged. The next morning, Jude returned as promised. They worked through the floor frame, laying down the tongue-and-groove planking that would become the cabin's foundation. The work was precise, each board fitting snug against the next, creating a solid surface that would support everything above it. During a water break, Brenna noticed Jude studying Theodore's journal, which lay open on a foundation block. "Your grandfather kept good records," Jude said. "Most people build, but they don't document. This is something else." He wanted to remember. Or maybe he wanted to teach. Brenna gestured to the journal. "There's wisdom in there beyond just measurements." Jude nodded slowly. "My uncle was like that. Taught me everything about timberwork. Said the woods would talk to you if you learned to listen." She looked up at Brenna. "You listening to what you're building?" "I'm trying to." "Good, because you're not just building a cabin. You know that, right?" "I know," Brenna said, and she did. This wasn't about shelter. It was about reconstruction, not just of a structure, but of herself. Every board she placed was an act of reclamation. Every nail driven was proof she still had strength, still had purpose, still had the right to take up space in the world. They worked until dusk, and when Jude finally packed up her tools, she paused before leaving. "I'll be back day after tomorrow. Got a workshop to teach in between. But you need anything before then. My place is a quarter-mile through those trees, due east. You'll know it when you see it." After Jude left, Brenna stood on her completed floor frame as darkness gathered. The surface was level and solid, strong enough to hold the weight of walls and roof, strong enough to hold the weight of her new life. She walked from corner to corner, feeling the give and resistance of the boards under her feet, understanding that what she'd built so far would be the foundation for everything that came next. Marcus called that evening, checking in with the regularity of someone who'd shifted from worried to supportive. She told him about Jude, about the progress, about the slow transformation of lumber into structure. "You sound different, Mom," he said. "Stronger. I'm remembering who I used to be," Brenna told him. "Before I forgot." That night, writing in Theodore's journal by lantern light, Brenna noted the floor completion and added her own reflection. Day 14. "The foundation is solid. Everything I build now stands on this. No shortcuts, no compromises. Just honest work done right. Theodore would approve. More importantly, I approve. The approval mattered. For so many years, she'd sought validation from others, her husband, her children, her community. Now, for the first time, her own judgment was enough. Week 3 arrived with the smell of autumn in the morning air. Brenna woke before dawn, her body clock reset to match the sun's rhythm. The tent that had seemed adventurous at first now felt small and damp, a reminder that she was racing against the calendar. Winter would come whether her cabin was ready or not. She spent the morning cutting wall studs, measuring each one precisely before making her cuts. The repetitive work had a meditative quality. Measure, mark, cut, stack. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, muscle memory building with each board. The pile of cut studs grew steadily, soldiers waiting to be raised. Jude returned mid-morning, her chainsaw still on her shoulder, but a different expression on her face, something thoughtful, appraising. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, framing out the first wall on the floor deck before they'd raise it. "Had a woman in my workshop yesterday," Jude said finally, holding a stud in place while Brenna nailed it. She'd never touched a chainsaw before, afraid she'd cut her leg off. By end of day, she was making precision cuts. "Know what changed?" "What?" Brenna asked, driving another nail home. She stopped apologizing, stopped saying sorry every time she asked a question or made a mistake. "Just focused on the work." Jude looked at Brenna meaningfully. "You do that too. Apologize for taking up space." Brenna paused, nail gun in hand, recognizing the truth of it. How many times in the past weeks had she said sorry to store clerks, to Kenny at the lumberyard, to Giles, even to Jude? Apologizing for asking questions, for needing help, for simply existing in spaces where she might be an inconvenience. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's a habit," Jude said. "Women our age, we were trained to make ourselves smaller. Takes work to unlearn it." They finished framing the first wall, 8 feet tall, 16 feet long, with spaces for windows that would eventually look out toward the tree line. When they raised it together, lifting it upright and bracing it vertical, Brenna felt a surge of something primal, a wall, the first vertical element of her cabin, standing against the sky. "This is real now," she said, stepping back to look at it. It was real when you cleared the first shovelful of dirt, Jude replied. You're just seeing it differently. They spent 3 days framing walls, and Brenna learned Jude's story in fragments between measurements. She'd lived downstate, she never specified where, with a woman named Andrea for 12 years. They'd built a life together, quiet and private, in a time and place that didn't approve. When Andrea died suddenly of an aneurysm at 46, her family had excluded Jude from the funeral, contested everything, taken even the photographs, lost her twice, Jude said, not looking at Brenna, focusing on aligning a stud. Once to death, once to people who couldn't admit she'd loved me. I'm sorry, Brenna said, then caught herself. No, I mean, that was cruel. What they did was cruel. Yes, it was. Jude drove a nail with more force than necessary. So I came here. Bought land no one wanted, built a place no one could take. Figured out who I was without her. Brenna thought about her own losses, her own rebuilding. Is it working? Figuring out who you are? Some days, Jude admitted. Other days, I'm just a woman living alone in the woods, teaching chainsaw safety to pay the bills. She looked at Brenna directly. But I'm not pretending anymore. That's worth something. The comments stayed with Brenna as they worked. How much of her life had been pretense? The happy marriage, the contented suburban mother, the woman who had everything figured out. All performance, all surface. While underneath, she'd been slowly disappearing. On Friday of that week, Olivia arrived unannounced, driving up in a rental SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the logging road. Brenna heard the engine and felt her stomach tighten. Her daughter, who'd been so upset about the divorce, seeing the reality of what Brenna had chosen. Olivia climbed out, wearing designer jeans and ankle boots, completely wrong for the terrain. Her hair and makeup flawless, even after the drive from the airport. She stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin's skeleton, walls rising from the floor deck, the shape of something becoming visible. Mom, she said, her voice carrying a mix of emotions Brenna couldn't quite pass. You're actually doing this. I am. Brenna set down her tools, acutely aware of how she must look, filthy work clothes, sawdust in her hair, hands scarred and rough. Do you want a tour? Jude appeared from around the far side of the cabin, and Brenna made introductions. Olivia shook Jude's hand with barely concealed curiosity, clearly trying to figure out the nature of their relationship. Just neighbors, Jude said, reading Olivia's expression with amusement. I'm helping because I know what I'm doing, and your mother's got ambition but not much experience. More experience every day, Brenna said mildly. Jude nodded to them both and headed toward the tree line. I'll leave you two to talk. Back Monday, Brenna. After she left, Olivia walked slowly around the build site, taking in the foundation, the walls, the careful stacks of lumber. She stopped at Brenna's tent, clearly horrified. Mom, you're living in a tent. You don't have running water. There's a porta potty over there. She gestured toward the plastic unit Brenna had rented. You're living like someone building a life from the ground up, Brenna finished. Yes, this isn't healing. This is punishment. Why? Brenna asked, keeping her voice level. Why is choosing discomfort for a purpose punishment? I'm stronger than I've been in 20 years. I'm learning skills I'd forgotten I had. I'm building something with my own hands. Why does that look like suffering to you? Olivia's eyes filled with tears. Because you left. You left, Dad. You left your home. You didn't tell us you were going. You just disappeared. And now you're here alone, building this thing like none of us matter. The truth landed between them, hard and necessary. Brenna sat down on a foundation block and gestured for Olivia to join her. I'm not building this because you don't matter, Brenna said carefully. I'm building this because I finally matter to myself. For 34 years, I was a wife. For 35 years, I was a mother. And I loved both those things, Liv. I love you and Marcus more than my own life. But somewhere in all that loving and caring and supporting, I stopped existing as a separate person. I didn't ask you to do that, Olivia said, wiping her eyes. I know. But I did it anyway. And when your father stopped seeing me, really seeing me, I realized I'd stopped seeing myself too. Brenna reached for her daughter's hand. I'm not running away from you. I'm running toward something, toward finding out who I am when I'm not performing a role. They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon light slanting through the trees, the half-built cabin standing patient behind them. Finally, Olivia spoke. "I've been doing the same thing," she said quietly. "Marketing executive, perfect apartment, perfect Instagram feed. It's all performance. I look at your posts. You haven't posted anything since you got here, and I'm jealous. You're actually doing something real." "You could too," Brenna said. "Not this exactly. But your own version." Olivia stayed through the weekend. She couldn't help much with construction in her inappropriate clothes, but she sat and watched, asking questions, gradually seeing the work as something other than her mother's breakdown. On Sunday, before she left, she stood with Brenna on the floor deck looking at the walls. "I still think you're crazy," Olivia said. "But maybe it's the kind of crazy I need to learn from." After she left, Brenna felt lighter, like some weight had shifted. Her daughter had seen her, really seen her, maybe for the first time since Olivia was a child. The approval she'd received felt different than before, more genuine, based on who Brenna actually was rather than who she was supposed to be. That evening, Brenna found Theodore's old carpenter's pencil in the bottom of his toolbox, worn down to a stub, marked with his teeth impressions from decades of holding it in his mouth while he worked. She ran her thumb over the marks, these tiny evidence of his presence, and felt the weight of inheritance differently. Not as obligation, but as permission. He'd built his life with his hands. Now she was doing the same. She used the pencil to mark the window frames, carefully placing each opening to capture morning light, afternoon sun, the view toward the trees where Jude had first appeared. These windows would frame her new life, letting in exactly what she chose to see. Week 5 brought the roof framing, the most technically challenging work yet. Brenna and Jude worked together on the complex angles and precise measurements, and their collaboration had evolved into something efficient and unspoken. They anticipated each other's movements, communicated through gesture and the occasional grunt, found satisfaction in the shared rhythm of building. On Tuesday morning, while moving stones to build up a low spot in the foundation perimeter, Brenna discovered something unexpected. A small, weatherproof tin box wedged in a gap between the old foundation stones. She worked it loose carefully, the metal cold against her palms. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, was a bundle of letters tied with string. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded but legible. Letters between her grandmother Louise and Theodore, dated 1953 and 1954. Brenna sat right there on the ground and began reading. The story the letters told was nothing like the simple, heroic narrative she'd always believed. In 1953, Theodore had left Louise and their 2 young children, Brenna's mother among them, to work the logging camps in Canada. He'd been gone almost a year. Louise's letters spoke of anger, loneliness, of feeling abandoned with babies and no support. She'd written things Brenna had never imagined her gentle grandmother thinking, "I don't know if I can forgive this. I don't know if I want you to come back." Theodore's replies spoke of shame and desperation. He'd felt like a failure as a provider, had gone north to make money for the cabin, to build something that would prove his worth. "I know I've done wrong by you," he'd written. "I'm trying to make it right the only way I know how." The final letters documented tentative reconciliation. Louise had agreed to let him return, but on condition. They would build the cabin together, equal partners. The cabin wasn't his gift to her. It was their shared project, a marriage rebuilt board by board. Brenna sat with the letters for a long time, her understanding of her grandfather reshaping itself. He hadn't been the uncomplicated hero of family legend. He'd been a man who'd failed, who'd hurt people he loved, who'd found his way back through patient work and Louise's hard-won forgiveness. The cabin she was rebuilding had been born from struggle and redemption, not simple competence. When Jude arrived an hour later, she found Brenna still sitting there, the letters spread around her. "You okay?" Jude asked, crouching beside her. "My grandfather left his family for almost a year," Brenna said. "I never knew. The story we were told was so much simpler." Jude picked up one of the letters. read a few lines with permission, set it down gently. People aren't monuments. They're just people who kept going. He built this cabin to make up for leaving, to prove something. Maybe, Jude said, or maybe he built it because he needed to build something after almost losing everything. Either way, he did the work, same as you. They carried the letters. Inside, what would be the cabin, setting them carefully on a protected shelf. Later, Brenna would frame them, make them part of the structure's history. But for now, they were a reminder that everyone's story was more complicated than it appeared from outside. That afternoon, working on the roof trusses, Jude shared more of her own story. After Andrea died and her family took everything, Jude had lived in her truck for 4 months, saving money, looking for land remote enough that no one would bother her. She'd found this parcel by accident, fallen in love with the isolation and the timber, bought it with cash from selling her chainsaw business back in wherever she'd come from. Built my cabin in 4 months, Jude said, measuring a rafter cut. Smaller than yours, no loft, but mine. Every decision mine. No one to answer to but myself and the building inspector. Do you get lonely? Brenna asked. Sometimes, but lonely. My choice is different than lonely while surrounded by people. Jude made her cut clean and sure. I've got my workshops, my work. People in town who'll nod hello. And now you, building something ridiculous next door. Ridiculous? A 61-year-old woman building a cabin alone in 90 days. That's ridiculous. Jude's expression softened. It's also brave as hell, but still ridiculous. They worked in compatible silence after that, the roof structure taking shape above them. By week's end, they had all the trusses up, braced and secured, standing under the skeleton roof, looking up at the geometric precision of the framing. Brenna felt something settle in her chest. This was actually happening. The cabin was rising from the ground, taking shape, becoming real. That weekend, Marcus called with news that surprised her. He wanted to visit. Not to talk you out of it, he said quickly. I just want to see what you're building. If you're okay with that. He arrived the next afternoon, driving a rental truck over the logging road with visible nervousness. When he climbed out and saw the cabin, walls up, roof framed, the structure substantial and undeniable, his mouth fell open. Mom, you built this. Still building, Brenna corrected, but she couldn't help smiling at his amazement. She gave him a tour, explaining the construction in detail, showing him Theodore's journal, the letters she'd found. Marcus listened with the attention he usually reserved for complex legal briefs, asking intelligent questions, clearly trying to understand what had compelled her to this. They had dinner that evening around a campfire. Simple food, camp stove cooking, nothing fancy. But they talked more honestly than they had in years. Marcus admitted he'd been questioning his own choices lately, wondering if corporate law was really what he wanted or just what he'd thought he should want. Watching you do this, he said, gesturing toward the cabin silhouette against the darkening sky, it's making me think about what I've been building. My life, I mean. And whether it's actually mine or just what I thought people expected. You're allowed to change course, Brenna said. I'm 61 and I'm doing it. You're 35. You have time. It doesn't feel that way. Wife, mortgage, partnership track. It all feels locked in. I had 34 years of marriage, a house, a whole identity locked in, Brenna countered. And I walked away. I'm not saying you should, but you could if you needed to. That's all I'm saying. You have permission to want something different. Marcus stayed through the next day, and Jude taught him to use a hammer properly, to trust his strikes, to find the rhythm of driving nails. He was clumsy at first, but by afternoon he'd found a groove, working on interior framing while Brenna and Jude handled the more technical roof work. That evening, before he left, Marcus hugged her longer than usual. I'm proud of you, Mum, he said quietly. I should have said that earlier. What you're doing here, it matters. After he left, Brenna stood at the clearing's edge, watching taillights disappear down the logging road. Her son had seen her, really seen her, and approved of what he saw. The validation mattered less than she'd expected. What mattered more was that she'd given her children permission, through her actions, to examine their own lives honestly. That felt like better parenting than anything she'd done when they were young. The cabin stood behind her in the twilight, walls solid, roof taking shape. No longer just a possibility, but a reality well on its way to completion. She'd passed the halfway point without noticing exactly when. The structure had its own momentum. Now, pulling her forward toward completion even on days when her body screamed for rest. Jude appeared beside her, carrying her chainsaw as always, ready to head back to her own place through the darkening woods. "Your boy's got good hands," Jude observed. "Learns quick." "He does," Brenna agreed. "Takes after his grandfather." "Takes after you, too," Jude said. "Don't sell yourself short." She shifted the chainsaw on her shoulder. "See you tomorrow. We'll start on the roof sheathing." "Tomorrow," Brenna confirmed. After Jude disappeared into the trees, Brenna walked back to her tent, lit her lantern, and opened Theodore's journal to write her nightly entry. She wrote about the letters, about Marcus's visit, about the roof taking shape, and then she added, "Day 35, halfway through the 90 days. The building is teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn, about perfection and imperfection, about legacy and complication, about how the strongest structures are built on honest foundations, even when the truth is harder than the legend." Week 7 arrived with the first hint of real cold, frost on the tent in the mornings, breath visible in the early light. Brenna's sense of urgency increased. She had 40-plus days left, but winter was coming faster than the calendar suggested. The windows and doors needed to be in, the structure weather-tight. Before the serious cold arrived, she spent her mornings working on window frames, learning the patience required to plane wood by hand until it fit perfectly. Each stroke of the plane peeled away a thin ribbon of wood, the surface growing smooth and true under her attention. There was something meditative about it, the repetitive motion, the gradual transformation of rough lumber into precisely fitted pieces. Jude had taught her the technique, showing her how to read the grain, how to let the wood tell you where it wanted to go. "Can't force it," Jude had said. "Wood has its own integrity. You work with it, not against it." The lesson applied to more than carpentry. Brenna was learning to work with herself, not against herself. To acknowledge when she was tired instead of pushing through blindly. To accept help instead of insisting on doing everything alone. Small shifts, but they added up to something larger. The first window went in on a Tuesday afternoon, fitted so precisely that it required no shimming. Brenna stood inside the framed structure, looking out through the opening at the forest beyond. She'd chosen this view, this angle, this specific frame for the world. The power of that choice, of deciding what to let in and what to keep out, felt enormous. By week's end, all 4 windows were installed, and Brenna could see how light would move through the cabin at different times of day. Morning sun through the east window, afternoon warmth from the south, evening glow from the west. She'd oriented the structure to capture specific qualities of light, something Theodore's journal had emphasized. A house isn't just shelter. It's a way of living with the day. That Friday, Marcus called with news that troubled her. He'd visited Robert, her ex-husband, at the house they'd shared. Robert was drinking more than usual, the house in mild disarray, clearly struggling with the divorce in ways he hadn't revealed. "He asked about you," Marcus said carefully. "Asked if I thought you'd come back." "And what did you tell him?" "The truth. That you were building a new life, literally building it, and that you seemed happier than I'd seen you in years." He didn't take it well. Guilt surfaced, familiar and insistent. Robert hadn't been a bad husband. He'd been faithful, financially responsible, present in all the ways that society valued. His failure had been one of attention, of seeing her as a person rather than a role. But that failure had been reciprocal. She'd stopped seeing herself too, stopped asking for what she needed, stopped believing she had the right to want more than comfortable sufficiency. "I'm sorry he's struggling," Brenna said, and meant it. "But I'm not coming back, Marcus. That life is over for both of us. The kindest thing I can do is let him move on. I know. I just wanted you to know." After they hung up, Brenna sat with the complexity of it. She could feel compassion for Robert's pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. That distinction between caring and carrying was something she was slowly learning. For decades, she'd carried everyone's emotions, tried to manage everyone's comfort. Now she was practicing a different kind of love, one that allowed people to struggle with their own feelings without swooping in to rescue them. The weather turned colder that weekend, and Brenna made her first visit to Jude's cabin. A storm was rolling in, serious rain with high winds, and Jude had insisted she waited out in a structure with a real roof rather than her tent. Jude's place was small, maybe 400 square feet, but perfectly crafted. Every joint was clean, every detail intentional. The cabin radiated a sense of someone who'd built exactly what they needed, nothing more, nothing less. One room served as living space, kitchen, bedroom. A loft above held storage. A wood stove dominated one wall, radiating heat, but what struck Brenna most was the wall of photographs. Images from Jude's other life, Andrea, beautiful and laughing, arm around Jude's shoulders. The two of them in various settings, hiking, at home, in what looked like their garden. Evidence of a life lived and lost. "I packed these away for a long time," Jude said, following Brenna's gaze. "Couldn't look at them without bleeding. But a few years back I realized hiding them wasn't protecting me. It was erasing her, so I put them up. She was beautiful," Brenna said. "She was everything." Jude's voice carried old pain, worn smooth by time but still present. "And she's gone." Both things are true. They spent the evening playing cards as rain hammered the roof and wind shook the trees. Jude's cabin held firm, testament to solid building and good design. Brenna studied the structure while they played, noticing the clever solutions Jude had engineered. Storage built into every available space. Windows positioned for maximum light and ventilation. The wood stove located to heat the entire space efficiently. "This is what I'm aiming for," Brenna said. "Not this exact design, but this level of integrity. Everything intentional." "You'll get there," Jude said, dealing another hand. "You're building good. Just don't forget—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Don't forget you're building for yourself, not to prove anything to anyone else. I'm not—" "You are." "Little bit?" Jude's expression was gentle but firm. "I see it. The way you push when you're exhausted. The way you're racing that 90-day deadline like it's handed down from heaven. Who are you trying to prove yourself to?" Brenna sat with the question, the cards forgotten in her hand. Who was she trying to prove herself to? Theodore. Her children, Robert. The people of Pinehaven who'd whispered about the divorced woman building alone. "Myself," she finally admitted. "I'm trying to prove to myself that I can finish what I start. That I'm not," her voice caught, "that I'm not the person who just faded away." "You already proved that," Jude said quietly. "You proved it when you cleared the first shovelful of dirt. The rest is just finishing the job." The storm raged through the night. Brenna slept on Jude's floor in a borrowed sleeping bag, listening to rain drum the roof and wind test the walls. The cabin held solid and sure, and Brenna understood that this was what she was building toward, not just shelter, but a place that could withstand whatever weather came. Morning brought clearing skies and a landscape transformed by rain. Brenna hiked back to her property to find her tent had partially collapsed, though her supplies had stayed dry. The cabin structure stood unchanged, water beading off the roof, running in proper channels. The building was working, doing what it was designed to do. She spent the day installing the front door, a piece she'd commissioned from a local blacksmith named Liam Corbett. He was 78, still working his forge, and had known Theodore. The door handle he'd forged featured an oak leaf and acorn pattern, representing growth and patience. "What you plant now might not grow for you," Liam had said when he delivered it. "But it'll grow." Installing that handle felt ceremonial. Brenna aligned it carefully, drove the screws with precision, tested the mechanism until it worked smoothly. The door opened and closed perfectly, the handle solid and beautiful in her palm. That evening, Marcus and Olivia both called. They'd apparently coordinated to check in. They talked for nearly an hour, the three of them. a conversation that ranged from construction progress to life philosophy to childhood memories they'd never discussed before. When they finally said goodbye, Brenna felt the fundamental shift in their relationship. They were becoming adults who could relate to each other honestly, rather than parents and children performing familiar scripts. She walked through her nearly complete cabin as twilight settled, running her hands along the walls, feeling the solidity of what she'd built. Windows installed, door hung, roof sheathed and ready for final roofing. The structure was weather-tight, the bones of it complete. What remained was finishing work, flooring, interior details, the wood stove installation, 7 weeks in. Roughly 3 weeks left. The timeline was tight but achievable, and Brenna realized she was no longer afraid of failure. Even if she didn't finish in exactly 90 days, she'd already accomplished what mattered. She'd reclaimed herself, rebuilt her life, proven that starting over wasn't just possible but necessary. Standing in her doorway, hand on that oak leaf handle, looking out at the forest darkening in evening light, Brenna felt a peace she'd been seeking for years. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not the end of uncertainty, but the confidence to meet it. She was home. Not yet in the structure, but in herself. And that made all the difference. Week 9 began with celebration. Brenna and Jude installed the last exterior board on a Tuesday morning, stepping back together to admire the completed shell. The cabin stood solid and true. Every line clean, every angle precise. What had been bare framing now looked like an actual building, something that would last. 63 days, Jude observed. Ahead of schedule. Interior work still to do, Brenna counted, but she couldn't suppress her smile. Flooring, wood stove, finished carpentry. Details. The hard part's done. They drove into Pinehaven that afternoon for final supplies, and Brenna noticed the town's attitude had shifted. Kenny at the lumberyard greeted her by name, asked about the build with genuine interest. Patty at the diner saved her the corner booth and brought coffee with a warm smile. Word had spread. The Vale woman was actually doing it, building that cabin herself, and the skepticism had transformed into grudging respect. At the hardware store, Brenna ran into Wendell Harp browsing the plumbing aisle. He looked uncomfortable when he saw her, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Miss Vale," he said, "I need to speak with you. Could you stop by my office when you have a moment?" Something in his tone set off alarm bells. "Is there a problem?" "Maybe, I hope not. But there's something I found in the old county files, and I'm required to bring it to your attention." Brenna's stomach dropped. "Can you tell me what it is?" "Better if we discuss it in my office." "With the actual documents." Harp glanced around at other shoppers. "Tomorrow morning?" She agreed, though anxiety knotted in her chest. That evening, she told Jude about the conversation. They sat on Brenna's front steps, actual steps now, leading to an actual door, watching sunset paint the trees gold and amber. "Whatever it is, you'll handle it," Jude said with more confidence than Brenna felt. "You've handled everything else. What if there's something wrong with the deed? What if I don't actually own this land?" "Then you fight, or you grieve, or you adapt. But you don't give up. That's not who you are anymore." The next morning, Brenna drove to the county office with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. Harp met her in the records room, spreading papers across a table with the careful movements of someone delivering bad news. "I've been digitizing old files," he began. "Part of a county-wide modernization project. And I found this." He slid a document toward her, yellowed paper dated 1973, dense with legal language she had to read twice to understand. When her grandfather received the land through inheritance in 1952, there had been complications she'd never known about. The land had originally been part of Ojibwe Treaty territory, returned to the tribe in a 1952 settlement. Theodore's father had secured a lifetime use clause, but with specific restrictions. No permanent structures over 800 square feet, no commercial use, and land reverting to tribal authority upon death of the holder unless the heir met certain criteria and applied for continued use within 5 years of inheritance. "Your grandfather died 10 years ago," Harp said gently. "The 5-year window closed 5 years ago. And according to this, his cabin was, he checked the paperwork, 950 square feet. Yours is similar, right? Brenna felt the world tilt. Are you saying I don't own this land? I'm saying the ownership is complicated. Technically, the land might have reverted to tribal authority when your grandfather died, because no one filed for continued use. But no one caught it. The land stayed on the tax rolls under your family name. Your father paid taxes, and when he died, it transferred to you. So there's a question about whether the reversion clause was properly executed. What does that mean for my cabin? I don't know. I'm required to report this to the tribal council. They'll have to make a determination about the land's status. Harp's expression was genuinely sympathetic. I'm sorry, Ms. Vale. I know you've put in months of work. Brenna sat there, documents blurring before her eyes. Everything she'd built, all the labor, the transformation, the reclaiming of herself, suddenly felt precarious. The cabin could be illegal. She might be forced to remove it. All of this might have been for nothing. She drove back to the property in a fog, unable to process the magnitude of what she'd just learned. Jude found her an hour later, sitting on the cabin floor, staring at nothing. "Tell me," Jude said, sitting beside her. Brenna explained everything, her voice flat with shock. The covenant, the restrictions, the potential reversion to tribal authority. When she finished, Jude was quiet for a long moment. So the land might not be yours. And even if it is, the cabin might violate the size restriction. Yes, and the tribal council will decide what happens. Yes. Jude stood, paced to the window, looked out at the forest. "When do they meet?" Harp said monthly. "Next meeting is in 5 days. Then you have 5 days to prepare. You go to that meeting. You explain what you've done and why. And you ask them, beg them if you have to, for an exception or a permit or whatever allows you to keep what you've built. Why would they grant me anything?" Brenna's voice cracked. "My family benefited from land theft. I built something that might violate their covenant. I'm just another white woman taking what isn't mine." "Maybe," Jude said. "Or maybe you're a woman who's been displaced in her own way, who found healing in building something with her own hands, and who's willing to acknowledge the complicated history and try to make it right going forward. That's a story they might understand, or they might tear it down." "They might," Jude agreed. "But you're going to show up and fight for it anyway, because that's what you do now. You don't just accept what other people decide about your life." That evening, Brenna called Marcus and Olivia, told them what had happened. Their responses surprised her. Instead of telling her to give up or move on, both immediately offered support. "I'm flying up," Marcus said. "The meeting is when, Friday?" "I'll be there Thursday night." "You're not doing this alone." "I'm coming too," Olivia added. "We'll all go together." Their solidarity meant more than Brenna could express. For years, she'd protected her children from difficulty, carried burdens alone so they wouldn't have to worry. Now they were choosing to stand with her, and the role reversal felt like its own kind of healing. She spent the next 3 days preparing. She compiled photos of every stage of construction, documented her grandfather's journals, wrote out a timeline of the build. Jude helped her research tribal land policy, understand the cultural context of the covenant, figure out how to approach the conversation with respect and honesty. The night before the meeting, Brenna sat in her completed but not finished cabin, lantern light casting shadows on walls she'd raised with her own hands. She thought about Theodore and Louise, about their separation and reconciliation, about how they'd built this cabin as an act of rebuilding their marriage. She thought about the Ojibwe families who'd lived on this land for generations before being displaced, about the layers of loss and claim that every piece of ground carried. She opened Theodore's journal and found an entry from late in his life. Written in shaking handwriting, "I've carried guilt about this land my whole life. Benefited from injustice I didn't create, but participated in by accepting the inheritance. I tried to be a good steward, to respect what the land gave me, to teach my granddaughter to do the same. But good stewardship doesn't erase the taking. I hope someday someone finds a way to make peace with all these truths at once." Brenna traced her fingers over her grandfather's words, understanding him better now than she ever had. He'd known the land's history, carried that knowledge as a weight. Tried to live right despite impossible circumstances. She picked up her pen and wrote in the margin, "Tomorrow I'll try to make that peace, grandfather. For both of us, not by pretending the complications don't exist, but by facing them honestly. That's all anyone can do." Marcus and Olivia arrived late that night. They set up sleeping bags in the cabin, the three of them together in the space Brenna had created. They talked until the lantern burned low, working through nerves and hope and realistic assessment of what might happen. When they finally slept, Brenna lay awake, listening to her children's breathing, feeling grateful for their presence, even as anxiety churned in her gut. Tomorrow would determine whether the cabin could stay or would have to come down. But regardless of what the tribal council decided, something essential had already been built, something no one could take away. She'd rebuilt herself, proven her capability, reconnected with her children in an honest way. The cabin was the visible evidence of that transformation, but it wasn't the transformation itself. Still, she wanted desperately to keep it. This place she'd built with her own hands, this home she'd created for the person she'd become. She wanted it more than she'd wanted anything in years. Sleep finally came as dawn approached, bringing dreams of walls rising and falling, of building and losing and building again, of finding home in the most unexpected places. Morning arrived too quickly, grey light filtering through the cabin windows Brenna had so carefully installed. She woke to find Marcus already up, making coffee on the camp stove, moving quietly to let Olivia sleep. When he saw Brenna was awake, he brought her a cup. "How are you feeling?" he asked, sitting beside her on the sleeping bag. "Terrified, hopeful, angry at myself for not knowing about the covenant earlier." Brenna wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Mostly just terrified. You're going to do great. You're going to tell them the truth, and they're going to see who you are. And if the truth isn't enough..." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said something Brenna hadn't expected. "Then at least you'll know you showed up and fought for what mattered. That's more than a lot of people ever do." Jude arrived at 8, carrying a thermos of better coffee than the camp stove could produce, and a calm competence that helped settle Brenna's nerves. They went over the presentation one more time. What to say, what to emphasize, how to acknowledge the complicated history without making excuses. "Remember," Jude said, "you're not asking them to ignore their rules. You're asking them to consider an exception based on specific circumstances. Be respectful, be honest, and don't grovel. You have a right to make your case." The drive to the tribal council building took 90 minutes. Marcus drove while Brenna sat in the passenger seat, going over her notes, her prepared statement, the documentation she'd compiled. Olivia sat in back, occasionally reaching forward to squeeze Brenna's shoulder in wordless support. The tribal administration complex sat on reservation land, a modern building that managed to honor traditional architecture while meeting contemporary needs. As they pulled into the parking lot, Brenna saw other vehicles, other people arriving for the public meeting session. Her case was just one item on the council's agenda. Inside, the meeting room was simple and dignified. 7 council members sat at a curved table facing rows of chairs for public attendees. The chairwoman, identified by her nameplate as Nokomis, Brenna learned later it meant grandmother in Ojibwe, was somewhere in her 70s, with silver hair worn in a long braid and eyes that missed nothing. Brenna. Her children and Jude sat in the front row. Wendell Harp sat nearby, looking apologetic. A few townspeople from Pinehaven had come too. Kenny from the lumberyard, Patty from the diner, Giles Pritchard. Their presence surprised and moved Brenna. They'd come to witness, maybe to support. The meeting proceeded through routine business, budget discussions, permit approvals, community updates. Brenna's item came near the end, listed as Land Covenant Review, Vale Property, Parcel 470315. Harp presented first, explaining how he'd discovered the 1973 document during the digitization project. He outlined the covenant's terms, the size restriction, the reversion clause, his professional opinion that the land status was unclear and required council determination. He spoke respectfully but factually, laying out the complexity without editorial comment. Then Nokomis turned to Brenna. "Miss Vale, would you like to address the council?" Brenna stood, her prepared statement in her hand. But when she looked at the 7 council members, people whose ancestors had lived on this land for generations, who'd been displaced and were now reclaiming what authority they could, her rehearsed words felt inadequate. She set the paper down and spoke from her heart. "Thank you for hearing me. My name is Brenna Vale. I'm Theodore Vale's granddaughter. I came north 4 months ago, after my marriage ended, feeling like I'd lost myself somewhere in the decades of being wife and mother and all the roles we perform. My grandfather taught me to build when I was young, and I thought if I could build a cabin the way he did, maybe I could rebuild myself too." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I didn't know about the covenant. That's not an excuse. Ignorance doesn't justify violation. But it's the truth. When I inherited the land, I believed it was mine, free and clear. I based my cabin design on my grandfather's, which was also too large. So if I'm guilty of violating the size restriction, he was too." One of the council members, a younger woman, asked, "What did you intend to do with the cabin? Live in it, age in it? Eventually, if I'm blessed to live that long, pass it to my children with the full truth of its history, not the simple story I was told, but the complicated reality. And how would you steward the land?" An older man asked. Brenna took a breath. "With respect and minimal impact. My grandfather's journals document his practices: selective harvest only, no clear-cutting, protecting the spring and creek. I'd continue those practices. I'd document everything, provide annual reports if required. I'd place formal acknowledgement on the property recognizing this is treaty land, held in trust, not truly owned in the way colonial law understands ownership." Nokomis leaned forward. "Do you understand that this covenant exists because our people were displaced from land we'd lived on for generations? That your family's ownership, however legal by colonial standards, represents our loss?" "I understand," Brenna said quietly, "and I don't have words adequate to that history. My grandfather knew it too. I found entries in his journal expressing guilt about benefiting from that displacement. He tried to live right, despite the impossibility of making that fully right. That's all I can offer to do. Live right, acknowledge the truth, try to honor both the land and its history." There was a long silence. Then Marcus stood. "May I speak?" Nokomis nodded permission. "I'm Brenna's son, Marcus Vale. I'm an attorney in Chicago, and I'd like to offer pro bono legal services to your tribal community for 1 year, as part of my family's commitment to making some form of restitution. I know that doesn't balance the scales, but it's something I can contribute." Olivia stood next. "I work in marketing and communications. I'd like to create educational materials about this land's history, about the treaty and the covenant, as part of our family's pledge to tell true stories instead of comfortable myths." The council members exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. Nokomis made a small gesture, and the council rose and filed into a back room for deliberation. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality. The waiting was excruciating. Brenna, Marcus, and Olivia sat in silence, holding hands like children. Jude sat nearby, solid and present. Patty caught Brenna's eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. The minutes stretched impossibly long. After 40 minutes, the council members returned and took their seats. Nokomis spoke, her voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "We've discussed your situation. Ms. Vale, we've weighed the covenant's terms against the circumstances you've described, and we've considered the offers your family has made." She paused, and Brenna's heart hammered against her ribs. "In our culture, building a home is sacred. It represents putting down roots with the land's permission. You didn't ask permission before you began, that's true, but you've asked now. And your willingness to acknowledge the complicated history, to accept conditions, to try to make right what can't truly be made right, that matters." Brenna held her breath. "We're prepared to allow you to complete and keep your cabin, but under specific conditions. First, the formal recognition plaque you mentioned must be installed prominently, acknowledging treaty land and Ojibwe history. Second, you'll provide annual land stewardship reports to this council. Third, tribal members will have right of access for traditional practices, maple tapping, wild rice harvest if applicable, ceremonial use. Fourth, you'll host one annual educational visit for tribal youth to learn traditional building methods. And fifth, upon your death, your heirs must reapply for continued use. There will be no automatic transfer of property rights. I accept all of those conditions, Brenna said immediately. Thank you. Thank you so much. This isn't a prize, Ms. Vale, Nokomis said, though not unkindly. It's a responsibility. You'll be building on borrowed land, borrowed time. We all are, really. Remember that, she gestured, and a council member brought forward a small bundle. Nokomis unwrapped it, revealing a beaded medallion, intricate patterns in traditional colors, beautiful and meaningful in ways Brenna knew she only partially understood. This is not a gift of approval, Nokomis said, placing it in Brenna's hands. It's a reminder of what we've discussed here, of complexity, responsibility, and the work of trying to live right on land with difficult history. Keep it where you'll see it. I will, Brenna promised, holding the medallion carefully, feeling its weight literal and symbolic. I'll honor what you've given me. I promise. The meeting adjourned. People came forward to speak with Brenna, some tribal members expressing cautious hope that this could be a model for other complicated situations, some expressing skepticism that she'd follow through. Brenna listened to all of it, accepted all of it, committed to proving through actions that her promises meant something. Outside, in the parking lot, Marcus and Olivia wrapped her in a fierce hug. Jude stood nearby, approval clear on her weathered face. You did it, Marcus said. Mom, you actually did it. We did it, Brenna corrected. All of us. I couldn't have without you. The drive back felt surreal, relief and gratitude washing over Brenna in waves. The cabin was hers, conditionally, responsibly, with full awareness of its complicated context. But hers nonetheless. When they arrived back at the property, the cabin stood waiting in afternoon light. They all stood together looking at it, this structure that represented so much more than wood and nails. We need to celebrate, Olivia said. Properly. Not just camp stove food. And we need to finish the interior, Marcus added, already moving toward the cabin. How much work is left? Flooring, final details, the wood stove installation, Brenna said. Maybe 2 weeks of work. Then we help, Olivia said firmly. We're here for the weekend. We'll work until we have to leave, and we'll come back for the finish. They spent the rest of that day working together as a family. Marcus learned to measure and cut flooring, while Olivia sanded window frames. Jude taught them both, patient and thorough, while Brenna worked on trim carpentry. The cabin filled with the sounds of work and occasional laughter, with questions and answers, with the satisfaction of building something together. That evening, they made a real dinner. Jude had brought supplies, anticipating celebration, and ate sitting on the cabin floor, backs against the walls Brenna had raised. They talked about the conditions the council had set, how to fulfill them honorably, what it meant to steward land you didn't own in any traditional sense. This is better, Brenna said at one point. Knowing the truth, accepting the responsibility. It makes the cabin mean more, not less. Marcus raised his coffee cup in a toast. To complicated truths and honest building. They all raised their cups, smiling, tired and satisfied, and together in ways that mattered. Later, after her children had fallen asleep, and Jude had walked back through the darkening woods to her own place, Brenna sat on her front steps with the beaded medallion in her hands. She studied the patterns in lantern light, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The divorce, the drive north, the first day clearing ground, every board raised, every nail driven, the discovery of her grandparents' letters, the boundary question. Today's hearing, it had all been necessary. The setbacks, the struggles, the moments of doubt. They'd shaped her as surely as she'd shaped this cabin. And now, with permission and responsibility both, she could finish what she'd started. She placed the medallion on the windowsill inside, where morning light would catch it, where she'd see it every day. A reminder of complexity, of trying to live right, of building a life on borrowed time with gratitude and care. Tomorrow, she'd continue the work. But tonight, she'd simply sit with the enormity of what had been preserved, grateful beyond measure for the chance to complete what she'd begun. Week 11 arrived with the sharp clarity of late autumn. The trees had turned gold and red, and the morning air carried the promise of winter. Brenna woke each day with renewed purpose, the council's decision giving her work a deeper meaning. She wasn't just building for herself now. She was building with permission and responsibility, honoring an agreement that acknowledged complexity rather than pretending it didn't exist. Marcus and Olivia had returned to their lives but promised to come back for the final weekend. In the meantime, Brenna and Jude worked steadily through the remaining interior tasks. The reclaimed wood flooring went down board by board, each piece fitted with precision. Brenna had sourced the wood from an old barn being demolished 30 miles away, lumber with history, with character, with the patina of time. Everything in this cabin should have a story, Brenna told Jude as they worked. Nothing new and anonymous. Everything chosen, everything intentional. The door handle installation became a ceremony. Liam Corbett, the old blacksmith, had created a piece of art, hand-forged iron shaped into an oak leaf and acorn pattern. When Brenna had asked about the symbolism, Liam had smiled. "Oak takes time to grow," he'd said. "Acorns fall, and sometimes they grow into trees you'll never see fully grown. But you plant them anyway. That's the work of building. You do it knowing you're part of something longer than your own life." Marcus held the door steady while Olivia aligned the hardware and Brenna drove each screw with deliberate care. When they tested it, the door swung smoothly, the handle solid and beautiful in her palm. She opened and closed it several times, feeling the satisfaction of perfect function meeting thoughtful design. "This is really happening," Olivia said, running her hand along the doorframe. "Mom, you've built an actual house." "Not quite finished," Brenna said, but she couldn't suppress her smile. The cabin had moved from possibility to reality, from dream to solid structure. The walls stood plumb and true, the windows let in carefully chosen light, the door welcomed and protected. What remained was detail work, the kind of finishing that transformed a building into a home. That evening, they had their last family dinner before Marcus and Olivia needed to leave. They sat in the nearly complete cabin, eating simple food that somehow tasted perfect, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation wandered through childhood memories, present challenges, future hopes. Brenna listened more than she spoke, hearing her children in new ways. Marcus talked about his marriage, about how watching Brenna rebuild had made him examine his own life with more honesty. He was considering a sabbatical, time to travel with his wife, to reconnect before the busyness of life made that impossible. "You taught me it's never too late to make changes," he said. "That lesson is worth everything." Olivia shared that she'd given notice at her marketing job. She'd accepted a position with an environmental nonprofit. Less money, but work that aligned with her actual values rather than just her resume. "I've been living for the Instagram post," she admitted, "making everything look perfect while feeling empty inside. Watching you build something real with your actual hands, Mom, it changed how I see everything." After they left the next morning, long hugs and promises to return soon, Brenna stood alone in the cabin and felt the shift. Her children had witnessed her transformation and been transformed themselves. That ripple effect, that teaching through example rather than instruction, felt like the best parenting she'd ever done. The following days passed in focused work. Jude continued to show up each morning, and they fell into their wordless rhythm. The cabin's interior came together piece by piece. Baseboards installed, window trim fitted, the loft ladder secured. Each detail received attention, nothing rushed, everything done right. On day 87, only 3 days from the 90-day deadline, Patty drove up with news. The diner's owner had backed down after her complaint. Rather than face a potential discrimination lawsuit, Marcus had helped her file the paperwork. He'd offered her a better retirement package and the respect she deserved. "I wouldn't have fought if I hadn't." "Watched you fight," Patty said, standing in the cabin doorway, marveling at what Brenna had built. You showed me that giving up isn't the only option. I'm glad, Brenna said simply. You deserved better than being pushed out. After Patty left, Brenna reflected on that idea of ripples. She'd built this cabin for herself, to reclaim who she was, to prove her capability. But the building had affected other people too, her children finding courage to examine their lives, Patty finding strength to stand up for herself. Even the people of Pinehaven, seeing a woman in her 60s accomplish something they'd thought impossible. Day 88 brought rain, heavy and cold, testing the cabin's weatherproofing. Brenna and Jude worked inside, installing the last pieces of trim, preparing for the wood stove delivery. They watched water run off the roof in proper channels, noted with satisfaction that nothing leaked, that the structure held perfectly against the weather. When the rain stopped and they stepped outside, everything smelled clean and sharp. The cabin stood solid behind them, steam rising from the wet roof in the sudden sunlight. Brenna looked at Jude and saw the same satisfaction in her face. Almost done, Jude said. 2 more days. 2 more days, Brenna echoed, hardly believing it. 90 days that had seemed impossible at the start, and now she stood at the threshold of completion, ready to finish what she'd begun. Day 89 dawned clear and cold, the last full day before Brenna's self-imposed deadline. She woke before sunrise, unable to sleep, and sat on her front steps, watching darkness give way to light. In 24 hours, the 90 days would be complete. The cabin was nearly finished, just final details remaining. But Brenna felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Jude arrived early, carrying her thermos and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," she said, handing it to Brenna. "Don't open it until you're done. After you light the first fire." "What is it?" "You'll see. Now let's finish this thing." They spent the morning on meticulous final work, checking every window for smooth operation, testing every door, making sure every detail functioned as intended. The wood stove had been delivered and professionally installed 2 days earlier, its chimney pipe rising through the roof, everything inspected and approved. All that remained was to test it, to light that first fire that would transform the cabin from empty structure to living home. But first, the last details. Brenna installed a simple mirror in what would be her bedroom, hanging it at the perfect height to catch morning light. She placed the beaded medallion on the windowsill where she'd see it every day, a reminder of responsibility and grace. She positioned Theodore's photograph above where the wood stove stood, her grandfather watching over the space she'd created in his tradition. Beside the photograph, she placed the bundle of letters between Theodore and Louise, framed together. The full story, the complicated truth, visible and honored. In the early afternoon, Kenny arrived from the lumberyard with the wooden sign he'd carved. Brenna's cabin. Built 2024. He helped her hang it near the door, stepping back to admire his work. "Your grandfather would be proud," Kenny said. "Hell of a thing you did, Miss Vale." "Brenna," she corrected gently. "And thank you for everything." After he left, Brenna walked the property one more time, circling the cabin, checking the exterior with a critical eye. 90 days ago, this had been an overgrown clearing with scattered foundation stones. Now a solid structure stood here, walls true, roof sound, every detail considered. She'd built this. With help, yes, but she'd done the work, made the decisions, seen it through from dream to reality. The recognition plaque arrived by courier mid-afternoon. Carved cedar. Professional lettering exactly as she'd designed it. Brenna and Jude installed it together near the entrance path, setting it in concrete so it would stand as long as the cabin itself. The plaque read, "This land is held in trust from the Ojibwe people, built with respect and gratitude. Brenna Vale, 2024. They stood back together, looking at it. "That's right," Jude said quietly. "That's honest." As evening approached, Brenna prepared for the first fire. She'd chosen wood carefully, pieces from an oak that had fallen naturally on the property during the big storm weeks ago, seasoned and split and stacked. This wood had grown here, lived here, would return here as heat and ash. The cycle felt important, meaningful. Marcus and Olivia called together on video, wanting to be part of the moment even from distance. We wish we were there, Olivia said, her face on the small screen emotional. But we'll be there next weekend for the proper celebration. Light that fire, Mom, Marcus added. You've earned it. Brenna set her phone up so they could watch, then knelt before the wood stove. Jude stood nearby, witness to this final threshold. Brenna arranged kindling carefully, struck a match, watched the flame catch and grow. She added larger pieces gradually, feeding the fire until it burned steady and hot. Heat began to fill the cabin, spreading through the space she'd created, warming walls she'd raised. Reaching corners she'd measured and cut and fitted. The cabin breathed with warmth, came alive in a way that felt almost magical. Brenna sat on her floor, in her cabin that she'd built with her own hands, and felt completion wash over her. Not the completion of the structure, though, that mattered, but the completion of a journey, a transformation, a rebuilding of self that had required every bit of strength and courage she possessed. How does it feel? Jude asked, sitting beside her. Like home, Brenna said. For the first time in longer than I can remember, like home. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside and the fire burned steady. Brenna thought about where she'd started, lost, invisible, fading into a life that had stopped fitting years ago. And now, solid, capable, present, living in a space she'd created for exactly who she was. Jude handed her the wrapped package. Now you can open it. Inside was a journal, leather-bound like Theodore's, but new blank pages waiting. A note tucked inside read, "For writing your own entries, your own wisdom, your own legacy." Brenna opened to the first page and wrote, "Day 89. First fire lit, the cabin is warm, solid mine. I built a house, but more importantly, I built myself back. That's the real structure. That's what lasts." She looked up at Jude, at the fire, at the walls surrounding them, and smiled. Tomorrow was day 90. Tomorrow she'd call it complete. But tonight she'd simply sit in gratitude, in warmth, in the profound satisfaction of work finished and life reclaimed. Day 90 arrived with morning light streaming through windows Brenna had measured, cut, and installed herself. She woke on her floor, not yet her bed that would come later, in her cabin, warm from her wood stove, surrounded by walls she'd raised with her own hands. The moment felt both monumental and quietly ordinary, which seemed exactly right. She made coffee on the camp stove, one last morning of roughing it before she'd finished the interior completely. Standing on her porch, mug warming her palms, she looked out at the property she was stewarding. The trees standing patient in their autumn colors, and felt a peace that went deeper than satisfaction. 90 days ago, she'd been someone else entirely. A woman who'd lost herself somewhere in the performance of roles, who'd stopped believing she could build anything meaningful. Now she stood here, calloused hands wrapped around coffee, muscles strong from labor, mind clear with purpose, knowing exactly who she was. The cabin stood behind her. Solid testimony to what was possible when you stopped asking permission and started building the life you actually wanted. Jude arrived mid-morning with a simple question. So, what now? I finished the details. Install a proper bed frame, hang curtains, maybe build some shelves. Live here, age here. Learn what each season feels like in this place. Brenna smiled. And I keep my promises to the tribal council. Start planning that youth workshop for next summer. Need help with any of that? Always, but Jude, Brenna turned to face her friend fully. Thank you for showing up that first day, for every day after, for teaching me and working beside me and not letting me give up when it got hard. You wouldn't have given up, Jude said with certainty. But you're welcome. It's been good, having a neighbor who understands what it means to build something true. They spent the day on final touches, small things that made the space more livable. Brenna hung the simple curtains she'd sewn, installed hooks for coats and tools, placed books on makeshift shelves. Each decision reflected who she was now, practical, honest, beautiful in an understated way. By late afternoon, Marcus and Olivia arrived with a truck full of supplies they'd coordinated secretly. A bed frame, linens, kitchen essentials, even a small dining table. They unloaded everything, while Brenna protested weakly, touched by their thoughtfulness. You built the house, Marcus said, carrying in the bed frame. We can furnish it. They spent the evening transforming the cabin from construction site to home. Olivia had an eye for placement, arranging things until the space felt balanced. Marcus assembled furniture with the same careful attention to detail he'd learned during the build. Jude contributed practical items she'd thought of: oil lamps, a good axe for splitting wood, fire starters for the wood stove. When they finished, the cabin glowed in lamplight, warm and welcoming. Brenna walked through it slowly, taking in what they'd created together. This was home, not the house on Maple Street where she'd lived for decades. This small cabin in the woods, built board by board, filled with intention and truth. That evening they cooked a real meal, not camp stove food, but something celebratory. They ate at the table her children had brought. The four of them crowded in the small space, talking and laughing and making plans. Olivia shared that she'd started creating the educational materials about the land's history, working with a tribal liaison to ensure accuracy and respect. Marcus talked about the pro bono work he'd begun, finding it more satisfying than his corporate practice. Jude listened mostly, but her presence felt like family too, chosen rather than given, but no less important. After dinner, they stood outside together watching stars emerge. The cabin behind them glowed from within, light spilling from windows onto the ground Brenna had cleared with her own sweat. It looked exactly like her grandfather's cabin in the photograph, but also nothing like it. Same basic design, different life, different meaning. What's the most important thing you learned? Olivia asked. In these 90 days? Brenna thought carefully before answering. That starting over isn't giving up. That building something with your hands teaches you about building a life. That it's never too late to remember who you are under all the roles you've performed. And that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. You've changed, Marcus observed. You stand differently, talk differently. I feel different, solid, like I'm standing on ground I claimed rather than ground someone gave me permission to occupy. They talked late into the evening, until Marcus and Olivia needed to leave for their early flights. The goodbyes were warm but not sad. They'd be back. This was beginning rather than ending. After they left, Jude prepared to head back to her own cabin. She paused in the doorway, looking at Brenna in the lamplight. You did it. Built a house in 90 days. Built more than a house, Brenna said quietly. I know. I was here. Jude smiled, rare and genuine. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow. And every day after, probably. You're stuck with me now. Good, Jude said, and disappeared into the darkness. Brenna stood in her doorway, hand on the oak leaf handle, looking out at the land she was stewarding. Behind her, the cabin's warmth. Before her, the forest dark and vast and full of unknown seasons to come. She was ready for both. She thought about Theodore and Louise, about building and rebuilding, about failure and forgiveness and patient work. She thought about her children finding their own courage, about Patty standing up for herself, about all the ways one person's transformation could ripple outward. Mostly, she thought about this. She'd built a cabin in 90 days, but the cabin wasn't the achievement. The achievement was remembering she was someone who could build, who could transform, who could claim her own life and live it on her own terms. The structure would stand long after she was gone, maintained by children or grandchildren, or returned to the tribe, or repurposed by future stewards. Its permanence mattered less than what it had taught her in the building. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and wrote in her new journal by lamplight, Day 90. The build is complete. The cabin stands solid and true. But what I built here goes deeper than wooden nails. I built myself back. I remembered who I was before I forgot. And that's the real work, the real achievement, the real structure that will carry me forward. This is my foundation now. Everything else I'll build on this. She set down the pen, turned down the lamps, and lay in her new bed in her cabin, listening to the wood stove's quiet crackle. The house settled around her, small sounds of a new structure finding its place, and Brenna felt herself settling too, not into complacency but into purpose, not into an ending but into a beginning. She'd built a house in the wild in 90 days. The result had left everyone stunned, but most of all it had left her transformed. And that transformation, that reclamation of self, that remembering of capability, that courage to start over when everyone thought it was too late, that was the real story. That was what would last.